The rain came down in sheets, blurring the streets of downtown Chicago into streaks of white and neon. My fingers were locked tight around the steering wheel of my beat-up Toyota Corolla, knuckles aching, palms slick with sweat. I checked the rearview mirror again. Still there. Evan Cole's black Audi clung to my tail like a shadow that refused to fade, its headlights cutting through the storm with ruthless precision. 3 cars back. Close enough that I could feel him breathing down my neck. I was 24 years old, running for my life from the man I once thought I loved. To come on, please, I muttered, pressing harder on the gas as another traffic light loomed ahead. The engine groaned in protest. It had been doing that for months, ever since I started juggling night shifts at a sports rehab clinic while scraping together money to finish my certification in physical therapy. My life was fragile, stitched together with long hours and stubborn hope. Until Evan decided I belonged to him, the light turned green. I surged forward. So did he. I caught a glimpse of his silhouette behind the windshield, phone raised to his ear. Calling someone. Reinforcements, maybe. Evan never liked handling things alone. My ribs still hurt from 3 nights ago when I'd finally told him I was done. He'd grabbed me hard enough to leave fingerprints, screaming that no one left him, that I was his, that he'd make sure I understood that one way or another I'd been hiding at my coworker Lily's place since then. Somehow, he found me anyway. The speedometer crept past 45 as I weaved through narrow streets lined with steel and glass towers, most of them dark at this hour. Chicago at night felt cold and hollow, like a city holding its breath. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat. I didn't need to look. The last message I'd seen at a red light still burned in my mind. You can't run forever, Mia. I turned sharply onto Wabash Avenue, tires screaming as the car fishtailed before regaining traction. Evan followed without hesitation, his engine roaring like a predator closing in. Rain battered the windshield, turning everything into a smeared watercolor nightmare. That's when I saw the intersection ahead, Wabash and 39th. If I could make it through before the light changed, maybe I could lose him in the side streets beyond. I floored it. The light shifted from yellow to red. I should have stopped, any sane person would have. But Evan's headlights were right there, and sanity had left me the moment I realized he was hunting me. I ran the light. Cross-traffic surged forward just as I entered the intersection. And then I saw it. A matte black SUV, massive, pristine, pulling out from the cross street. A custom armored Escalade, the kind of vehicle that didn't belong to regular people. Tinted windows. Polished rims. The kind of car you saw in headlines, not parking lots. Time slowed. I saw the angle. The speed. The exact moment my car slammed into the side of the impact felt like a bomb going off. My airbag exploded into my face with a chemical sting, my body snapping forward as metal shrieked and glass shattered. The world became noise and pressure and pain, then nothing. Silence. Rain tapped against twisted steel. Steam hissed from somewhere under the hood. I tasted blood. Oh God, I whispered, staring at the deflated airbag. Oh God. I'd just destroyed my car. I'd run a red light. And I'd hit a vehicle worth more than I'd earn in years. Shaking, I forced the door open and stumbled into the rain. My Corolla was finished. Front end crushed. Radiator bleeding steam. The SUV barely looked touched, just a deep dent and scraped paint that somehow still screamed expensive. Then I heard doors opening. Not 1. 3. I looked up, and my stomach dropped. 3 men stepped out of the SUV. The first was lean, dressed in a dark suit despite the rain, moving with controlled precision. I noticed the subtle bulge under his jacket. A shoulder holster. The second was massive, built like a tank, scanning the street with the calm awareness of someone used to violence. But the third man. He came from the driver's side. Tall. Broad-shouldered. Early 30s, maybe. His suit was tailored to perfection, rain sliding off it like it didn't dare cling. Dark hair, sharp features, and eyes so cold and steady they seemed to pin me in place. Those eyes told me one thing instantly. This man didn't call the police when problems happened, problems disappeared. He walked toward me slowly, rain soaking the pavement around us. You just caused $40,000 in damage, he said calmly, his voice smooth, touched with a faint European accent. Do you know that? I'm sorry, I stammered. I didn't mean to. He studied my shaking hands, the bruises on my wrists I hadn't managed to hide. Then he said quietly. Good. That means you're alive. I blinked. What? Before I could process his words, tires screeched behind me. Evan's Audi slammed to a stop. The man's gaze flicked past me once, just once, toward Evan's car. Something unreadable passed through his eyes. Then he looked back at me. My name is Luca DeSantis, he said. And tonight, you just stepped into my world. Rain kept falling, but no one moved. The man, Luca DeSantis, stood between me and the wreckage like the storm answered to him. His men had already positioned themselves without a word, subtly boxing me in, their presence heavy and deliberate. Behind us, Evan burst out of his Audi. Mia, he shouted, his voice sharp with forced concern. Thank God you're okay. Stop, Luca said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't look at Evan when he said it. But Evan stopped anyway. I felt it, the shift in the air. Evan's confidence faltered for the first time since I'd known him. He took in the SUV, the suits, the way Luca's men moved like a trained unit. This is none of your business, Evan snapped, trying to recover. She's my girlfriend. Luca finally turned to him. And smiled. It wasn't warm. It wasn't friendly. It was the kind of smile you saw right before something irreversible happened. Is that so? Luca asked calmly. Because my understanding is, she's been trying very hard to get away from you. Evan scoffed. You don't know what you're talking about. Luca tilted his head slightly. One of his men stepped forward, murmuring something in Italian into his ear. Luca nodded once. Then he looked at me. Mia Carter, he said. My breath caught. How do you? 24, he continued, as if reading from a file. Graduate student. Physical therapy track. Works nights at a private rehabilitation clinic on South State Street. Lives alone. No family in the city. My heart slammed against my ribs. Evan's face drained of color. This doesn't concern you, Evan said again, but now his voice wavered. We'll handle this ourselves. Luca laughed softly. You already did, he replied. Very badly. He turned fully toward Evan now, his expression sharpening. Evan Cole, Luca said, owes a considerable amount of money to people who don't appreciate excuses. And tonight, you were supposed to deliver something of value to make those problems go away. Evan froze. What the hell are you talking about? Luca's eyes flicked back to me. Do you want to tell her, he asked Evan mildly, or should I? My stomach twisted. Tell me what? I whispered. Evan lunged toward me. I barely had time to gasp before one of Luca's men moved fast. Too fast. Evan was slammed back against his car, an arm pressed hard against his throat. Touch her again, Luca said quietly, and they won't find your body. Rain dripped from Evan's hair as his eyes went wide with terror. Luca stepped closer to me, lowering his voice. You didn't know, he said. That's obvious. If you had, you wouldn't have been driving tonight. Driving from what? I asked. From being traded, he answered. The word hit like a slap. Traded? Luca's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He borrowed money he couldn't repay, Luca said. When time ran out, he offered an alternative form of payment. My ears rang. No, I said. That's not, he wouldn't ask him, Luca said. I looked at Evan. He couldn't meet my eyes. Something inside me cracked. You were chasing me, I said slowly, understanding dawning with horror. Not because you wanted me back. Evan swallowed. You were delivering me. Silence stretched, thick and suffocating. I had no idea, I whispered. I know, Luca said. He straightened and gestured once. His men released Evan. Evan collapsed to the ground, coughing, gasping for air. Luca looked down at him. "Your debts are no longer your biggest concern," he said. "But you are no longer hers." Evan looked up in panic. "Please, please, I can fix this." Luca turned away. That was all it took. Two men grabbed Evan and dragged him toward the SUV. He struggled, shouting my name, promising everything and nothing all at once, then the back door slammed shut. And Evan Cole vanished into the rain. I stood there shaking, barely able to process what I'd just witnessed. "Where are you taking him?" I asked. "Somewhere he won't bother you again," Luca replied. The way he said it told me I didn't want details. He turned back to me. "You can't go home tonight," he said. "You're no longer safe." I didn't agree to any of this, I said weakly. "No," Luca said. "But you're alive because of it." He gestured toward the open door of the SUV. "Get in." I hesitated. Every instinct screamed that stepping into that vehicle would change my life forever. But I had nowhere else to go. And deep down, I knew something else too. Whatever Luca DeSantis was, criminal, monster, savior, he was the only thing standing between me and the people who would use me like property. I got in. As the door closed and the city lights blurred past bulletproof glass, Luca sat across from me, calm and composed, like this was just another night. "You're under my protection now," he said, "and protection," he added softly, "always comes with a price." The SUV didn't head toward the city. It moved away from it. Street lights thinned. Traffic faded. Rain softened into a steady rhythm against thick, tinted windows that reflected my pale face back at me like a stranger. I sat rigid in the leather seat, hands clenched in my lap, painfully aware of the two men flanking me. They hadn't spoken since we left the crash site. They didn't need to. Across from me, Luca DeSantis loosened his cufflinks as if this were a routine inconvenience instead of a night that had shattered my life. "Where are you taking me?" I asked. "Somewhere secure," he replied. "For now." "For now?" My voice cracked. "You don't get to decide that." Luca looked up, his dark eyes steady. "I already did." The city skyline disappeared behind us, replaced by tree-lined roads and iron gates that slid open without a sound. The SUV turned onto a private drive that curved through manicured grounds toward a massive estate of stone and glass. My breath caught. This wasn't a house. It was a fortress pretending to be a mansion. The vehicle came to a smooth stop beneath a covered entrance. More men waited there, silent, armed, watching everything. Luca stepped out first, rain barely touching him. "Welcome," he said, offering his hand as if escorting me into a gala to my home. I ignored his hand and stepped out on my own. Inside, everything was marble, soft lighting, and quiet control. A chandelier glittered overhead, reflected perfectly in polished floors. It smelled like money and power and something faintly dangerous. "This is kidnapping," I said, my voice echoing slightly in the vast space. Luca removed his jacket, handing it to a woman who appeared out of nowhere. "No," he replied calmly. "This is containment." "For what?" "For you." I spun to face him. "I didn't do anything." "Exactly," Luca said. "And that's the problem." He walked toward a long table where a tablet waited. With a swipe of his finger, images appeared, documents, photos, bank transfers. "Evan Cole owed money," he said. "To a Russian syndicate trying to push into my territory. When he couldn't pay, he offered collateral." My throat tightened. "Me?" "Yes." I stared at the screen, nausea rolling through me. "He signed contracts," Luca continued. "Using your name. Your schedule. Your medical background." "My medical background?" Luca looked at me carefully. "You understand anatomy. Pain thresholds. Recovery times. You know how to hurt someone without killing them." I recoiled. "That's not what I do." "I know," he said quietly. "But they don't care." He shut off the screen. "When Evan disappeared tonight," Luca went on, "they assumed one of two things. Either I took you as leverage or you're working for me. I'm not, I said immediately. They won't believe that. I wrapped my arms around myself. So what happens to me? Luca studied me for a long moment, then spoke with brutal honesty. You stay here. Under my protection. Until the threat is removed. And if I refuse? He didn't hesitate. Then you walk out that door, he said, gesturing behind me. And the people waiting will take you apart piece by piece to see what you know. The silence that followed was absolute. I sank into the nearest chair. This isn't a choice, I whispered. No, Luca agreed. It isn't. A pause. But you will be treated with respect. I let out a hollow laugh. While being locked in a mansion. Luxury doesn't change reality, he said. It just makes it survivable. He gestured toward the staircase. Your room is upstairs. You're free to move within the house. You'll have security at all times. I'm a prisoner. Luca's gaze sharpened. You're alive. That night, I lay awake in a bed bigger than my apartment, surrounded by silk sheets and silence so deep it felt unnatural. Designer clothes hung in the closet. Shoes lined neatly by size, my size. Toiletries I'd only ever seen in ads filled the bathroom. Everything was perfect, everything was wrong. I stared at the ceiling, heart pounding. Somewhere below, Luca DeSantis controlled an empire built on violence and loyalty. And for reasons I still didn't fully understand. He'd decided I belonged inside it. Morning light spilled through floor-to-ceiling windows, too soft for a place built like a stronghold. I woke slowly, disoriented, tangled in sheets that felt far too expensive to belong to me. For half a second, I almost believed it had all been a dream. Then I noticed the discreet camera in the corner of the ceiling. Reality snapped back into place. A knock sounded at the door, polite, controlled. Miss Carter, a man's voice said. Mr. DeSantis would like to see you for breakfast. Would like. I got dressed in clothes I didn't remember buying, tailored, understated, perfectly my size. Even my shoes fit like they'd been measured. Breakfast was served in a room larger than my entire apartment. Only 2 places were set. Lucas sat at the far end of the table, already dressed in a dark suit, scrolling through messages on his phone as if he weren't running a criminal empire before 9 a.m. Good morning, he said, looking up. I sat across from him. You forgot to mention I'd be watched while I sleep. You forgot to ask, he replied calmly. And no one is watching you like that. That's not reassuring. He smiled faintly. It wasn't meant to be. I took a sip of coffee. It was perfect. That irritated me more than it should have. So, I said, what happens next? Lucas set his phone down. Last night wasn't an isolated incident, he said. Evan's disappearance created a vacuum. People will come looking. For him or for me? For leverage, Luca replied. Which means you. I stiffened. I won't be handed over, I said. Not to anyone. You won't be, Luca said. That would imply you're something that can be traded. Then why does this still feel like a cage? He leaned back slightly, studying me. Because you value freedom more than safety, he said. Most people don't. A sharp sound cut through the room, his phone vibrating again. Luca glanced at the screen, his expression hardening. They're testing my perimeter, he said. Who is they? People who want to see how serious I am about keeping you. The words settled heavy in my chest. I didn't ask for this war, I said. No, Luca agreed. But wars don't ask permission. Later that afternoon, I learned just how literal that was. The first shot came from beyond the estate walls, distant, but unmistakable. The house locked down instantly. Doors sealed. Lights shifted. Men appeared from nowhere, moving with lethal coordination. I was escorted into a reinforced room hidden behind a wall panel. This is insane, I said, heart racing. All of this, for me? Lucas stood in the doorway, already rolling up his sleeves, this isn't because of you, he said. It's because you're mine now. The words hung between us. I don't belong to anyone, I said quietly. He met my gaze. Not in the way you think, he said. But if you're under my protection, the world sees you as an extension of me. Gunfire echoed in the distance. And that, he added, comes with rules. Hours later, when the threat had passed and the estate returned to its unnatural calm, Luca found me in the library. You handled that better than most, he said. I shouldn't have to handle it at all. No, he agreed. But you did. He stepped closer. There's a problem, he said. A legal one. I frowned. Let me guess. Your enemies don't respect verbal agreements. They respect titles, Luca said. Contracts. Bloodlines. And I'm what? I asked, already sensing the answer. A liability? You're a vulnerability, he corrected. Which makes you dangerous. He paused. The safest position for you, Luca continued, is one they can't touch without declaring war. I swallowed. And what position is that? His eyes never left mine. My wife. Silence crashed down between us. You can't be serious. I don't make jokes about survival, Luca said. I stood abruptly. You're talking about ownership dressed up as protection. I'm talking about leverage, he replied. And ending this before it escalates. And what do I get? Luca's voice lowered. Power, he said. My name. My protection. And the freedom to say no to anyone else. I stared at him, pulse roaring in my ears. You'd marry someone you barely know? Luca's gaze softened, just slightly. I know enough, he said. And you're already paying the price for my world. This simply makes it official. I shook my head. I need time. He nodded once. You have until they make their next move, he said quietly. After that, choice disappears. As he walked away, I realized something terrifying. This wasn't about romance. It was about survival. And the man offering me a ring wasn't asking for love. He was offering me a throne built on danger. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Luca's expression when he said the word wife, not possessive, not mocking, but calculated. Like a man placing the final piece on a chessboard. Morning came anyway. By noon, the house felt different. Quieter. Tenser. Men moved through the halls with purpose, speaking in low voices. Phones rang and stopped abruptly. Doors opened and closed without explanation. Something was happening. I found Luca in his study, standing in front of a wall of screens displaying maps, numbers, and camera feeds from places I didn't recognize. You're preparing for something, I said. He didn't turn around. They are. Who? The Volkov group, he replied. The people Evan owed. My stomach twisted. They know I'm here. They know you're with me, Luca said. That's worse for them. And more dangerous for you. I crossed my arms. You said the marriage idea was about ending this. It is, he said. But they don't believe it yet. I frowned. Then how do we convince them? Luca finally faced me. We let them think the decision has already been made. The words landed hard. You mean? An announcement, he said. Nothing legal. Nothing binding. But enough to send a message. I stared at him. You're going to use me? Yes, Luca said without hesitation. And if you're smart, you'll use me back. That stopped me. I don't like being manipulated, I said. Neither do I, he replied. But manipulation is cheaper than funerals. Before I could respond, the door opened. A man I hadn't seen before entered, older, sharp-eyed, wearing a tailored gray suit. This is Adrian Russo, Lucas said. My legal counsel. Adrian nodded politely. Miss Carter. Mia, I corrected automatically. He smiled faintly. For now. I shot Luca a look. He didn't apologize. Adrian placed a tablet on the desk. On the screen was a photo of me leaving the estate earlier that morning, flanked by Luca's men. Below it, a headline in a private intelligence feed. DeSantis Association confirmed possible engagement. My breath caught. This leaked, I said. No, Luca replied. It was released. I turned on him. You said this wasn't binding. It isn't, he said calmly. But perception is. I felt anger rise, sharp, burning. You're turning my life into a message. Luca stepped closer, his voice low. You walked into my world the night you ran that red light, he said. This is what staying alive looks like in it. Silence stretched. Then something unexpected happened. I didn't back away. Then stop treating me like a liability, I said. If I'm part of the equation, I want to understand it. Luca's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but interest. You want briefings, he said. I want truth, I replied. No more half answers. No more decisions made about me. Adrian watched us carefully, like a man witnessing a shift in power. After a moment, Luca nodded. Fine, he said. Sit. He gestured toward the chair beside him, not across the desk. I sat. For the next hour, Luca explained things he'd never intended to share: territories, alliances, threats, names that carried weight in the criminal underworld. He didn't soften it. Didn't lie. And I listened. Really listened. Patterns emerged. Pressure points. Weak links. At one point, without thinking, I said, they're not testing your strength. Luca paused. No? They're testing mine, I continued slowly. They want to see if I panic. If I break. If I beg to be handed over. The room went very still. Adrian looked at Luca. Luca looked at me, and? Luca asked. And they won't get that, I said. Something changed then. Not in the room. In me. That evening, Luca stood beside me on the terrace as the city lights glowed in the distance. The announcement worked, he said. They pulled back. For now, I replied. He glanced at me. You didn't have to step into this. Yes, I said. I did. He studied my face, searching for fear. He didn't find it. You realize, he said quietly, once they believe you're mine, there's no going back. I met his gaze. I'm not doing this because I belong to you, I said. I'm doing it because I refuse to be hunted. Luca's mouth curved slightly. Good, he said. Because queens don't survive by running. The word sent a shiver through me. Queen. I wasn't wearing a ring. But the city was already watching. And for the first time since the crash, I wasn't just surviving. I was choosing where to stand. They dressed me like a statement. Not glamorous. Not soft. Intentional. A black silk dress, clean lines, no jewelry except a single diamond ring slipped onto my finger without ceremony. My hair was pulled back, makeup minimal, sharp enough to be noticed but impossible to dismiss. This isn't the engagement ring, Adrian said, adjusting the fit. It's symbolic. Symbolic of what? I asked. Authority, Luca replied from the doorway. I looked at the ring. It felt heavier than it should have. The event was held at a private gallery overlooking the rivered glass walls, armed security disguised as staff, invitations sent only to people who mattered. Crime lords, financiers, politicians who pretended not to recognize us. When Luca and I entered together, the room changed. Conversations stalled. Eyes followed. Phones were subtly lowered. He placed a hand at the small of my back, not possessive, but unmistakably present. Stay close, he murmured. And don't explain yourself to anyone. I wasn't planning to. Good answer. We moved through the crowd like something rehearsed. Luca spoke when necessary. I watched who avoided us. Who stared too long? Who smiled without warmth? Then I saw them. Two men near the far wall, identical calm, identical eyes. Russian. Volkov Group. One of them raised his glass slightly in my direction. A test. I met his gaze and didn't look away. Beside me, Luca went still. Good, he said under his breath. They saw that. Let them, I replied. Minutes later, a woman approached, elegant, sharp smile, eyes that calculated faster than most men in the room. Elena Marquez, she said, extending her hand. Luca, it's been a while. He took her hand politely. Not long enough? Her gaze slid to me. And this must be the reason half the city is nervous tonight. Mia Carter, I said calmly. Nice to meet you. She smiled. Is it? Before she could say more, Luca spoke. We're announcing something. The room quieted almost immediately. That alone told me everything about the power he carried. Luca lifted his glass. Thank you for coming, he said evenly. I'll keep this brief. There's been speculation regarding my personal affairs. A pause. Mia is under my protection, he continued. That will not change. His hands settled over mine. And any action taken against her, he said, his voice dropping just enough to sharpen, will be considered an act against me. Silence. Then the soft clink of glasses. Applause, measured, careful. The message landed. As the night wore on, I realized something unsettling. No one questioned my presence. They accepted it. Because Luca had declared it. Later, in a private lounge overlooking the river, Luca poured me a drink. You were perfect, he said. I didn't do anything. You did, he replied. You didn't flinch. I hesitated. They're going to push back. Yes, Luca said. Sooner now. I looked at the city below. Then we should be ready. His brow lifted slightly. We. That night, back at the estate, I found a folder waiting in my room. Inside were documents, profiles, financial structures, security layouts. At the top was a note in Luca's handwriting. If you're going to stand beside me, you should know what you're standing on. I sat on the bed, papers spread around me. This wasn't protection anymore. It was preparation. And as I studied names and networks, one truth became clear: the world already believed I was Luca DeSantis's future wife. The only question left was whether I would use that belief or let it use me. The message came the next morning. Not to Luca. To me. A private number. No caller ID. You're alone now. I stared at the screen, pulse steady in a way that surprised me. I didn't reply. Instead, I memorized the timestamp. 7 minutes later, Adrian was standing in the doorway of my room, his expression grim. Did you receive a message? He asked. Yes. Did you respond? No. Good answer. They're testing your reaction, Adrian said. If you panic, they escalate. If you hide, they follow. And if I don't do either? I asked. Adrian studied me carefully. Then they adjust. I found Luca in the lower security office, surrounded by screens and men who paused the moment I entered. They contacted me, I said. The room went silent. Luca's jaw tightened. Show me. I handed him the phone. They want to see if you can keep me on a leash, I added quietly. His gaze snapped to mine. They want to see if you can, he corrected. He dismissed the room with a gesture. Once we were alone, Luca spoke. They won't move openly yet, he said. They'll try something small. Personal. What kind of something? A meeting, he replied. Or an invitation disguised as courtesy. I exhaled slowly. Then let's not disappoint them. He frowned. That's not funny. I'm not joking, I said. You taught me the rules. Let me use them. Luca stared at me for a long moment. No, he said finally. Not alone. Then don't make it look like protection, I replied. Make it look like confidence. That afternoon, the invitation arrived. A charity luncheon at a private members club downtown. Neutral ground. Public enough to discourage violence. Exclusive enough to feel like a challenge. They want me to attend, I said, reading the details. Alone. Luca shook his head. Absolutely not. They already expect me to, I said. If I don't show, I look controlled. And if you do, you look exposed. I met his gaze. Then we change what exposed looks like. Silence stretched between us. Finally, Luca said, 1 hour. Security embedded. 1 word from you, and we shut it down. Deal. The club was all white marble and polite smiles. I arrived without Luca, wearing a tailored navy suit instead of a dress. Heads turned. They hadn't expected that. I felt them watching, assessing. The Volkov representative approached 10 minutes in. Tall. Calm. Dead eyes. Miss Carter, he said smoothly. I'm glad you accepted. I prefer to see things for myself, I replied. He gestured toward a table. Please. We sat. You understand why we're curious about you, he said. Women don't usually stand where you're standing. I'm not standing, I said. I'm choosing. A flicker of interest crossed his face. You know, he said, Luca DeSantis is known for many things. Commitment is not one of them. Then it's fortunate I don't rely on reputation, I replied. He leaned closer. If you ever feel uncertain about your position, there are alternatives. I smiled. That would be disloyal, I said. And disloyalty is expensive. The word landed. His smile thinned. Then this was enlightening, he said, rising. Enjoy your lunch. He left without another word. Exactly 48 minutes after I arrived, I stood and walked out. Outside, a black car waited. Luca was inside. He didn't speak until we were moving. Then, they won't underestimate you again. I looked out the window. Good. He exhaled slowly, something like relief slipping through his control. You were calm, he said. You didn't blink. I told you, I replied. I won't beg. He studied me in a way he never had before, not like something fragile. Like something dangerous. Back at the estate, Luca handed me a slim folder. What's this? I asked. Access, he said. Limited. But real. I took it. For the first time since the crash, I understood the truth. I wasn't being tested anymore. I had passed. The first sign was subtle. A camera feed went dark for 3 seconds. 3 seconds didn't mean anything to most people. To Luca, it meant everything. I was in the study with him when it happened, documents spread between us. He froze mid-sentence, eyes snapping to the monitors. Lock the West Wing, he said into his earpiece. Now. The room shifted instantly. Doors sealed. Alerts flashed. Men moved. What is it? I asked. Someone is testing internal access, Luca replied. Which means they already have it. My stomach tightened. An insider. Yes. I stood. Then they're not coming for you. They're coming for me, Luca said, already reaching for a weapon. No, I said quietly. They're coming for us. He looked at me sharply before he could respond. A sharp crack echoed through the estate. A gunshot. Too close. Luca grabbed my wrist and pulled me toward a concealed corridor. Alarms blared now, low, pulsing, predatory. Stay behind me, he ordered. We moved fast. Controlled. No panic. At the end of the corridor, 2 of Luca's men were already down. One wasn't moving. Blood smeared the marble floor. My breath caught, but I didn't scream. Because I understood now. This was the cost. A figure broke from the side hall. Don't move! It was Marcus. One of Luca's senior security leads. A man who'd escorted me daily, joked with the staff, earned my trust without trying. The gun in his hand was steady. Marcus, I said slowly. Put it down. His eyes flicked to me, just for a second. Guilt. Then resolve. I'm sorry, he said. This was never personal. Luca stepped forward. You sold us out, he said evenly. Marcus swallowed. You made enemies I couldn't afford. And you thought this would save you? Luca asked. They promised me a way out. Luca nodded once. They always do. The standoff lasted seconds. Marcus moved. Luca fired. The sound was deafening. Marcus hit the floor, the gun skidding across marble. Silence crashed down. I stared at the body. This wasn't theory anymore. This wasn't strategy. This was death. Luca turned to me, scanning for shock, fear, regret. What do you feel? He asked quietly. I searched myself. Then answered honestly. Anger, I said. That he thought I was weak enough to be collateral. Luca's expression changed, something dark and approving. Good, he said. That means you're still thinking. Later, after the estate was secured and the body removed, I stood alone on the terrace, hands gripping the railing. Luca joined me, the night air heavy between us. This is why I didn't want you involved, he said. This is why I had to be, I replied. He studied me. You could still walk away, he said. Disappear. I'd make it happen. I shook my head. They'd hunt me, I said. And you know it. Yes, he agreed. And, I added, running doesn't stop this. Ending it does. A long silence. Then Luca said, You're changing the board. So are you, I replied. He looked at me sharply. You didn't break tonight, he said. Most people do. I don't have the luxury, I said. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small velvet box, not a ring. A key. This opens everything I have, Luca said. Accounts. Safe houses. Information. I stared at it. This isn't symbolic, I said. No, he agreed. It's trust. I took it. The weight felt different from the ring. Heavier. Final. That night, lying awake, I realized the truth. The enemy wasn't outside the walls. It was already inside me. And I wasn't afraid of it anymore. I didn't tell Luca my plan right away. Not because I didn't trust him. But because I needed to know if the idea held weight on its own, if it was strategy, not emotion. The key he'd given me sat heavy in my pocket. Access. That was what Marcus had wanted. I used it. Late that night, I went to the lower network room, the one Luca rarely mentioned but never locked from me. Screens hummed softly. Data flowed like a living thing. I wasn't looking for secrets. I was looking for patterns. The Volkov group hadn't pushed again since the failed test. That meant they were watching, recalculating. Waiting for a mistake. So I gave them one. At least, that's what it would look like. The next morning, a controlled leak went out through one of the compromised channels. Marcus had used an old safe house location, recently emptied but not publicly abandoned. Adrian found out within an hour. This is reckless, he said flatly, holding the tablet up. Someone is feeding information. Yes, I replied. Me. He stared. Luca arrived moments later, tension radiating off him. You did what? He asked. I set bait, I said. They think I'm inexperienced. Emotional. That I'll overreach. And you won't? Luca said sharply. I already have, I replied. On purpose. Silence fell. You're using yourself as leverage, Luca said. No, I corrected. I'm using their expectations. He studied the data, jaw tight. You should have told me. You would have stopped me, I said. And you would have been right. That's why it had to be my call. Anger flashed in his eyes, then something else. Respect. Where? He asked. South Dock Warehouse, I replied. They'll send a small team first. Scouts. If they think it's a trap, they won't come themselves. And if they don't? Then they confirm how much they underestimate me. Preparations moved fast. By nightfall, Luca's men were in position, hidden, silent. I watched from the control van, headset snug against my ear. You stay here, Luca ordered. I stay until it works, I replied. The Volkov scouts arrived just after midnight. 3 men. Armed. Careful. They moved through the warehouse exactly as predicted, and then they triggered the lock. Steel doors slammed shut. Lights snapped on. Luca's voice cut through my headset. Now. It was over in under 2 minutes. Clean. Precise. No unnecessary shots. As the last man was restrained, Luca turned toward the camera. You planned this, he said. Yes. And if it had gone wrong? It didn't. He exhaled slowly. You're not reckless, he said finally. You're dangerous. I swallowed. Is that a compliment? It's an admission, he replied. Later, alone in the quiet of the estate, Luca poured us both a drink. You crossed a line tonight, he said. So did you, I replied. You followed my lead. He didn't deny it. You can't protect me and command me at the same time, I said quietly. Choose. He met my gaze. I choose partnership, he said after a moment. The words settled between us, heavy, deliberate. That night, as I stood at the window watching the city lights, I realized something fundamental had shifted. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was acting. And somewhere out there, our enemies had just learned a dangerous lesson. I wasn't the weakness in Luca DeSantis's empire. I was the escalation. The Volkov group didn't respond with violence. That was how I knew the message had landed. 2 days passed in uneasy calm. No leaks. No threats. No tests. Then Luca received the call. He didn't put it on speaker. He didn't need to. I watched his expression change, tightening, sharpening, while he listened. When he hung up, the room felt colder. They want a meeting, he said. Where? I asked. Neutral territory, he replied. Old ground. One of the last places they still respect. And the price? Luca looked at me. You. The word hit, but it didn't break me. Not custody, he continued. Status. I folded my arms. Explain. They want confirmation, Luca said. Public. Irreversible. Adrian entered, already holding documents. A formal union, he said. Registered. Recognized. Not just rumored. Marriage. Not symbolic this time. Real. I laughed softly. So that's it. Sign the paper, end the war. It would end this phase, Luca said carefully. And start another, I replied. Silence. They're afraid of you, Luca said finally. That's why this works. I took a breath. And if I say no? Then they escalate, Adrian said. Targets expand. Collateral increases. I looked at Luca. You won't force me. No, he said immediately. I won't. But the truth hung there anyway. He didn't have to, the cost would do it for him. That night, I stood alone in the empty ballroom of the estate, marble cold beneath my bare feet. A place built for celebrations. 4 cages. Luca found me there. You don't have to do this, he said. I know. He stepped closer. I'll burn everything before I trade you. And how many people burn with it? I asked quietly. He didn't answer. I turned to face him. This isn't about belonging to you, I said. It's about ending the hunt. He searched my face. You'd bind yourself to my world forever. I already am, I said. The difference is whether I pretend otherwise. A long moment passed. Then Luca said, if we do this, it won't be ownership. I smiled faintly. It never is. It's alignment. The meeting took place at a historic riverside hall, stone walls, neutral flags, men with eyes like loaded guns. Volkov himself was there. Older than I expected. Calm. Calculating. He studied me openly. So, he said, in accented English. This is the woman who disrupted my operation. I met his gaze. Your operation was fragile. A murmur rippled through the room. Volkov smiled thinly. You accept the terms? He asked Luca. Luca didn't answer. I did. Yes, I said. With conditions. Volkov raised a brow. I will not be hidden, I continued. I will not be sidelined. And any action taken against me will be answered by both of us. Luca turned sharply. Mia. Volkov laughed. I like her, he said. Very well. Contracts were placed on the table. I signed first. The pen felt steady in my hand. When Luca signed beside my name, the sound echoed louder than any gunshot. The war paused. But as we left the hall, Luca caught my hand. This changes everything, he said. Yes, I replied. I looked down at the ring now real on my finger. And now, I added softly. They'll find out what they just married into. The announcement went public within hours. Not the romance. The fact. DeSantis union confirmed. No photos. No ceremony. Just confirmation. That was enough. By morning, the city had adjusted. Calls came in waves, congratulations disguised as reconnaissance, condolences masked as curiosity. Men who had avoided Luca now wanted meetings. Women who had ruled quietly wanted to know where I stood. I stood beside him at the long conference table, my name newly etched onto folders I hadn't touched before. This is your seat now, Adrian said quietly, pulling out the chair at Luca's right hand. Not behind him. Beside. The meeting began without ceremony. Territory disputes. Supply interruptions. A rumor of movement from the South Docks. I listened. And then I spoke. The docks aren't the threat, I said. The room stilled. Several men exchanged looks. They want us looking outward, I continued. Because what's coming is internal. Luca didn't interrupt. Marcus wasn't an exception, I said. He was a proof of concept. Adrian nodded slowly. They're testing loyalty, I finished. And we're going to let them think it's working. A murmur rippled. Luca leaned back slightly. Explain. We announce a restructuring, I said. Small demotions. Quiet transfers. Make it look like instability. And when they move? Luca asked. We watch who moves with it, I replied. Silence. Then Luca smiled. Do it, he said. That was the moment. Not when I signed my name. Not when I wore the ring. When my plan became policy. By nightfall, the city shifted again. Names changed positions. Lines blurred. Whispers traveled. And someone took the bait. The breach came at midnight. A minor safe house, nothing critical, was compromised. A clean job. No bodies. Just information gone. I was already in the operations room. Lock everything, I said. Don't chase. Luca's head turned sharply. You're sure? Yes, I said. They want panic. Minutes later, the call came. From inside. A lieutenant I'd spoken with that morning. I can fix this, he said too quickly. Just give me. No, I replied. You already did. The line went dead. By dawn, we had our list. Not one name. 5. Luca reviewed it in silence. You're dismantling my inner circle, he said finally. I'm rebuilding it, I replied. With people who choose the future, not the past. He studied me for a long moment. You're colder than I expected, he said. I met his gaze. You taught me what warm costs. That night, Luca didn't sleep in his wing. He came to mine. Not with threats. Not with control. But with questions. What happens, he asked quietly, when they stop testing and start targeting you directly? I didn't look away. Then they'll learn, I said, that marrying me didn't protect you from them. I stepped closer. It protected them from me. For the first time since the crash. Luca DeSantis looked uncertain. And in that moment, I understood the truth. I hadn't married into his power. He had married into mine. They didn't come for Luca. That was the mistake. The attack happened in broad daylight, during what should have been a routine inspection of a medical outreach center Luca funded downtown. Neutral ground. Cameras everywhere. Too public for a hit. Which meant it wasn't meant to kill me. It was meant to test me. The first sign was the silence. No street noise. No footsteps. The security channel in my earpiece went dead for half a second. Half a second was enough. Down, I said, already moving. The glass wall exploded inward. I hit the floor as shards rained down, the sound sharp and absolute. Luca's men moved instantly, forming a barrier around me as alarms screamed. Smoke filled the room. Through it, I saw him. A boy, really. Early 20s. Hands shaking around a gun that wasn't meant for close range. He wasn't Volkov. He was local, disposable. Mrs. DeSantis, he called, voice breaking. They said if I just scared you. He didn't finish. Security had him pinned in seconds. Alive. That was deliberate. They brought him to the holding room beneath the estate before Luca even arrived. I was already there. You shouldn't be here, Luca said when he saw me. I should, I replied. This is about me. The boy sat trembling in the chair, eyes darting, sweat streaking his face. They promised me money, he said. Said you'd be protected anyway. I studied him. No training. No loyalty. No ideology. Just desperation. Who? I asked. He shook his head. I don't know names. Luca leaned close to me. This is where it ends. I handle this. I looked at him. No, I said quietly. This is where it begins. I turned back to the boy. You have two options, I said evenly. You tell us everything, and you live long enough to regret it. He swallowed hard. Or, I continued, you keep lying, and you disappear quietly. Today. Tears spilled down his face. I don't want to die, he whispered. Neither did the people you were meant to scare, I replied. Talk. He did. Names. Routes. Payments. A chain of intermediaries meant to keep Volkov clean. Enough. When he finished, the room was silent. Luca watched me carefully. What do you want done with him? He asked. This was it. The line. I walked closer to the boy I saw myself, months ago. Running. Afraid. Powerless. Then I stepped back. Turn him over, I said. To the people he owes. Luca stiffened. That's worse than killing him. Yes, I said. And he'll be a message. The boy sobbed. Luca searched my face. You're sure? He asked quietly. Yes. The order was carried out. No blood on my hands. Just consequence. That night, Luca found me on the balcony. You crossed something today, he said. I know. Do you feel anything? I thought about it. Then answered. Clarity. He studied me for a long moment. You're not becoming like me, he said slowly. I replied. I'm becoming what this world requires. He reached for my hand. This time, I didn't pull away. Because I understood the truth now. Power doesn't come from violence. It comes from deciding who doesn't get your mercy. The message wasn't subtle. It arrived through 3 channels at once: an intercepted call, a leaked document, and a warning from an ally who stopped answering afterward. Primary threat identified: MIA Santos. Not Luca. Me. They've changed their strategy, Adrian said, voice tight. You're no longer leverage. What am I now? I asked. Command, Luca answered from across the room. The operations center was alive with movement. Maps updated in real time. Red markers spread like a slow infection across the city. They won't negotiate anymore, Luca continued. They'll isolate you. Force mistakes. Push you into hiding. I shook my head. That's what they expect. Luca's jaw tightened. This isn't a game. No, I agreed. It's a message war. He stepped closer. Then let me end it. With fire, I said. And bodies. With certainty, he corrected. I met his gaze. At what cost? He didn't answer. That silence was the crack. The first strike came that night. Not bullets. Banks froze accounts tied to my name. Shell companies collapsed within hours. A clinic I once worked at was raided on fabricated charges. My past was being weaponized. They're trying to erase you, Adrian said. They're trying to remind me who I was, I replied. Luca slammed his hand on the table. I should never have let you be exposed. And I should never have been protected like glass, I shot back. The room went still. You want me locked away, I said quietly. Safe. Silent. I want you alive. And I want this finished. We stood there, neither willing to step back. Finally, Luca spoke. If you stay visible, they will come for you directly. Good, I said. Then we stopped dancing. I turned to Adrian. Prepare a summit. His eyes widened. A what? An open one, I continued. All factions. Neutral ground. No shadows. Luca stared at me. You're inviting them to aim at you. Yes, I said. And to miss. That night, Luca came to my room again. Not to plan. To argue. This isn't bravery, he said. It's provocation. It's control, I replied. They're used to you responding. Not me acting. You don't have to carry this. I already am. He stopped pacing. You're asking me to trust you, he said. No, I said softly. I'm asking you to stop trying to own the risk. Silence stretched between us. Then Luca said something I hadn't expected. If I lose you, he said quietly, this empire means nothing. The words hit harder than any threat. I stepped closer. This empire survives because it adapts, I said. So do we. He searched my face for fear, doubt, hesitation. He found none. Fine, he said at last. We do it your way. The summit announcement went out the next morning, public. Precise. Impossible to ignore. And across the city, phones lit up. Because they understood now. This wasn't Luca DeSantis's war anymore. It was mine. And I had just invited them all to watch what happened next. The summit was held in a restored opera house downtown, neutral territory. Historic. Public enough to make blood inconvenient, private enough to make threats meaningful. By the time Luca and I arrived, the building was already full. Not just criminals. Financiers. Fixers. Political intermediaries. People who never appeared in headlines but shaped them daily. They all came for the same reason. Me. I walked in beside Luca, dressed in white this time. Not innocence. Contrast. The whispers started immediately. That's her. She's the reason Volkov pulled back. She's the one who ordered it. Good. Let them talk. We took our seats at the front. Luca's presence anchored the room, but I felt the shift. Eyes weren't sliding past me anymore. They were measuring. Volkov arrived last. He didn't look at Luca. He looked at me. You're ambitious, he said casually as he took his seat. That usually shortens lives. I'm efficient, I replied. That extends them. A few people laughed nervously. Volkov smiled thinly. You called us here to talk? I called you here to listen, I said. Luca glanced at me sharply but didn't interrupt. I stood. Screens behind the stage lit up. Documents. Transfers. Names. You've all been wondering what happens next, I continued calmly. So I'll make it simple. The first slide changed. A ledger. Private payments. Shell companies. Familiar faces. Gasps rippled through the room. These are internal leaks, someone muttered. Yes, I agreed. And external mistakes. Volkov's smile faded. You think exposure protects you, he said. No, I replied. It defines the battlefield. I nodded once. The next slide appeared. Live footage. A warehouse. Armed men restrained on the floor. Volkov went still. You were planning to make a point tonight, I said evenly. An assassination staged as chaos. Silence crushed the room. They're alive, I continued. For now. Volkov rose halfway from his seat. You set me up. Yes, I said. Publicly. The doors at the back of the hall closed. Security shifted. Not Luca's men. Mine. That was when the room understood. This wasn't Luca DeSantis standing behind me. He was standing with me. You crossed a line, Volkov said, voice low. So did you, I replied. You aimed at me. I stepped closer to the edge of the stage. From now on, I said, any action taken against me will be treated as a declaration of war. I paused. And I finish wars. A gunshot rang out. Not from the crowd. From the balcony. Chaos erupted. People screamed. Ducked. Ran. I didn't move. Because I'd expected it. Now, I said calmly, the shooter was down in seconds. The room froze. I looked directly at Volkov. This is what restraint looks like, I said. You brought violence. I brought witnesses. Sirens wailed in the distance, real ones. Volkov sat back slowly. This changes things, he said. Yes, I agreed. It ends them. When the room finally cleared, Luca turned to me, his expression unreadable. You didn't tell me about the shooter. No, I said. Because you would have stopped it. And you let it happen. I controlled it, I corrected. A long silence followed. Then Luca said quietly, you scared them. I shook my head. I replaced you. He searched my face. Then, slowly, he smiled. God help anyone who underestimates you. As we walked out of the opera house into flashing lights and chaos, I knew one thing for certain. They would never call me leverage again. They would call me power. The city didn't explode. It recalibrated. That was always the sign of real power shifting, not chaos, but silence. Deals paused. Calls went unanswered. People waited to see who would blink first. It wasn't Luca. It was me. By morning, 3 alliances had gone quiet. 2 financial corridors rerouted. 1 long-standing agreement dissolved without explanation. They're freezing you out, Adrian said. Soft pressure. Good, I replied. That means they're afraid of hard pressure. Luca watched from the other side of the room, arms crossed, expression unreadable. You're becoming the Axis, he said finally. They'll test how much weight you can carry. Let them, I said. I don't bend quietly. The first real test came without warning. A regulatory task force announced an investigation into the DeSantis Foundation, the legitimate arm funding clinics, schools, outreach programs. My name was on every document. They're coming for your credibility, Adrian said. Not your body. Luca slammed his hand on the table. We shut it down. No, I said. We let it run. He stared. That foundation protects lives. And if we interfere, I replied, it proves their point. Silence. This isn't your call, Luca said sharply. I met his gaze. It is, I said. Because they're not attacking you. They're attacking the idea of me. The words landed heavy. That night, Luca came to me not as a leader, but as a husband. You're pushing too fast, he said quietly. You don't have to win every battle. No, I agreed. Just the right ones. You're not invincible. I don't need to be, I replied. I need to be consistent. He exhaled slowly. You're locking me out. I'm redefining the door, I said. That was the fracture. Not loud. Not violent. Just real. The investigation deepened. Files were subpoenaed. Old colleagues were questioned. My past was dissected in conference rooms I'd never see. They're waiting for a crack, Adrian warned. They'll find discipline instead, I said. And then the call came. A judge compromised, but careful, offered a deal. The foundation survives. In exchange, I step back. Publicly. Permanently. They want you gone, Luca said. This ends if you walk away. I looked at the city through the window. Then it doesn't end, I said. I turned back to him. They didn't understand the opera house, I continued. This isn't about fear. It's about legitimacy. Luca frowned. And how do you plan to secure that? I smiled slightly. By letting them watch me survive scrutiny, I said. And still stand. The next morning, I held a press conference. No lawyers. No shields. Just facts. I answered every question. Released every record. And when they asked if I regretted marrying Luca DeSantis, I don't regret alignment, I said. I regret underestimating how uncomfortable it makes people. The city watched. And for the first time since the crash. They weren't waiting for me to fall. They were waiting to see what I'd do next. The press conference didn't explode. It settled. That was the part no one expected. No scandal followed. No hidden evidence surfaced. The investigation stalled, not because it was blocked, but because there was nothing left to dig up. Transparency was a weapon they hadn't planned for. Within days, headlines shifted tone. From suspicious union to unexpected disciplinado de Santa's wife defies expectations. Legitimacy didn't arrive with applause. It arrived with hesitation. And then acceptance. The task force is backing off, Adrian said one morning, setting his tablet down. Quietly. Luca looked at me across the table. You just did what 10 lawyers couldn't, he said. I sipped my coffee. I gave them nothing to threaten. That was when it happened. Not outside. Inside. Luca stopped issuing orders around me. He started asking. avoiding my gaze at first. Then meeting it. Thoughts, he asked during a logistics briefing. It was subtle, but everyone noticed. You don't outrank me, one lieutenant muttered later that day. I met his eyes calmly. Then stop following me, I said. He didn't. That night, Luca stood with me on the balcony again, the same place where everything had shifted months ago. I don't know how to protect you anymore, he said quietly. I turned to him. That's because I don't need to be protected, I replied. I need to be backed. He nodded once. I can do that. For the first time, it felt like truth, not concession. Then the warning came. A single message routed through 3 dead channels, you won't see this one coming. No signature. No threat. Just certainty. They're out of moves, Adrian said. Which makes them reckless. I felt it too. The city was too calm. Too still. The final move came at dawn. Not against us. Against what made us untouchable, the Foundation's largest clinic caught fire. Not an accident. Accelerant. Timed ignition. No casualties, but the message was clear. They couldn't discredit me. So they targeted what proved I mattered. Luca was furious. This ends now, he said. We retaliate. I watched footage of firefighters moving through smoke. No, I said. He turned sharply. They crossed. They want rage, I interrupted. They want us loud and predictable. I looked at him. So we respond differently. How? We rebuild, I said. Publicly. Immediately. Bigger. He stared. They burned one symbol, I continued. We replace it with 10. Silence stretched. Then Luca smiled, slow, dangerous, proud. You're not ending the war, he said. No, I agreed. I'm making it irrelevant. By nightfall, plans were already moving. New locations. New funding. New alliances. And somewhere in the city, our enemies realized the truth too late. They hadn't created fear. They'd created momentum. As Luca and I stood together watching the city lights, he said softly. They're going to try one last thing. I nodded. I know. And when they do? I met his gaze. Then, I said, we stop reacting. And start finishing. The city went quiet again. Not the strategic silence from before. This one felt wrong. Phones still rang. Cars still moved. Meetings still happened. But underneath it all was a tension so tight it felt like the city itself was holding its breath. They've gone dark, Adrian said. Every channel. Every proxy. That means they're done negotiating, Luca replied. I didn't speak. Because I already knew. The call came at 2:14 a.m. Not to Luca. Not to Adrian. To a number I hadn't used in years. My old clinic phone. I answered without speaking. A familiar voice came through the line, calm. Older. Controlled. Mrs. DeSantis, Volkov said. You rebuild very quickly. My fingers tightened around the phone. What do you want? I asked. To finish this, he replied. Properly. Luca was already moving toward me, eyes sharp. I held up a hand. Volkov continued, you've proven something impressive. You can survive pressure. Exposure. Loss. A pause. But can you survive attachment? A screen on the wall lit up. Live feed. A room I recognized instantly. White walls. Soft lighting. Children's drawings taped unevenly near the door. The Foundation clinic. My chest tightened. A nurse sat bound to a chair, shaking. Someone I knew. Someone who'd trusted me. They volunteered to stay late tonight, Volkov said mildly. Very dedicated. Luka's voice was lethal. You touched the man. And what? Volkov interrupted. You burned cities? You already tried fear. I swallowed hard. What are your terms? I asked. Volkov smiled through the phone. You come alone, he said. No guards. No announcements. And if I refuse? He tilted the camera slightly. The nurse whimpered. You won't, Volkov said. The call ended. The room was silent except for my breathing. No, Luka said immediately. Absolutely not. They're not bluffing, I replied. I don't care, he snapped. I will not trade you. This isn't a trade, I said quietly. It's a correction. I turned to face him. They learned the wrong lesson from the opera house, I continued. They think I only know how to control rooms. Luka grabbed my hands. You don't go alone. I have to, I said. Because that's the point. This is a trap, he said. Yes, I agreed. And they think it's theirs. I stepped closer. You told me once wars don't ask permission, I said. Neither does responsibility. His jaw clenched. You come back, he said. Or I burn everything. I met his eyes. You'll burn it after, I said softly. Because if this works, there won't be anything left to burn. Minutes later, I was in a plain car. No escort. No weapons, just me. The location Volkov sent was an old riverside warehouse, abandoned, exposed, perfect. I stepped inside alone. The door closed behind me. Lights flicked on. Volkov stood waiting. Smiling. You see, he said. Attachment. I didn't answer. Because this time, I wasn't here to negotiate, and for the first time since this war began. They had no idea what I was about to do. The warehouse smelled like oil and rust. Lights hung too bright overhead, leaving nowhere for shadows to hide. Volkov stood at the center of the space, hands relaxed at his sides, men positioned just far enough back to look respectful. The nurse was still alive. That was the first thing I checked. Good. You came alone, Volkov said, almost approving. That tells me everything. No, I replied calmly. It tells you what you want to believe. He smiled. Still pretending this isn't fear. I took a step forward. I'm not here because I'm afraid, I said. I'm here because you made a mistake. Volkov gestured lazily. Enlighten me. You assumed attachment makes me weak, I continued. That I'd trade myself to preserve something fragile. His smile widened. But attachment, I said, is how you learn where pressure actually works. I raised my voice slightly. Release her. Volkov laughed. Or what? I looked past him, at the men he trusted. At 1:47 a.m., I said evenly, every account tied to your Western operations was frozen. Volkov's smile faltered. At 1:52, I continued, 3 of your lieutenants were detained crossing borders they thought were clean. A beat. And at 2:01, I finished, your private server mirrored itself to agencies you've paid for decades to avoid. The room shifted. Men glanced at each other. Volkov's eyes sharpened. You're lying. I shook my head. You taught me escalation. Luka taught me power. I met his gaze. But legitimacy? I said softly. That was mine. Volkov stepped closer, voice low. You think this ends me? No, I replied. I think it ends this version of you. I nodded once. The doors behind him burst open. Not police. Not Luka's men. His. Half of them. Weapons lowered. Faces grim. The nurse was released immediately, pulled safely away. Volkov turned slowly, understanding dawning too late. You planned this, he said. Yes, I replied. You wanted me alone. I wanted you exposed. He looked at me then, not amused, not condescending. Measured. You're dangerous, he said quietly. I inclined my head. So are you. That's why you're finished. Sirens sounded in the distance, real ones, unavoidable ones. Volkov exhaled, something like admiration in his eyes. You didn't win by force, he said. No, I agreed. I won by removing your future. He nodded once. Then he turned, raised his hands, and waited. When I stepped outside, dawn was breaking. Luca was there. Not rushing. Not frantic. Watching. He crossed the distance slowly, stopped in front of me. You didn't call for backup, he said. I didn't need rescue, I replied. I needed silence. He studied me, then nodded. I understand now, he said. Behind us, Volkov was taken away. The war ended without a final gunshot. Luca took my hand, not to claim, not to shield. To stand. You didn't survive my world, he said quietly. I looked at the rising sun over the river. No, I replied. I changed it. And for the first time since the crash. There was nothing left chasing me. Only what came next. The city didn't celebrate. There were no headlines announcing the end of a war, no public acknowledgments of what had almost torn it apart. Power never leaves receipts. But things changed, quietly. Permanently. Volkov disappeared into systems that don't forget names. His network collapsed without drama, accounts seized, proxies dissolved, territories absorbed by smaller players who understood restraint. The noise faded. What remained was order. The Foundation reopened its clinics within weeks, bigger, brighter, harder to touch. New donors appeared, careful and respectful. Inspections came and went without incident, legitimacy had settled in. I stood in the main conference room one morning, sunlight cutting clean lines across the table, watching men and women wait for me to speak. They didn't look at Luca first anymore. They looked at me. I gave instructions without raising my voice. They followed. Later, on the balcony, Luca joined me. You're thinking about leaving, he said. I smiled slightly. Not running. Choosing, he corrected. Yes. He nodded, accepting it the way powerful men only do after losing the right to object. You don't need this world, he said. I never did, I replied. But it needed boundaries. He studied me. And us? I turned to face him. We were never a romance, I said. We were alignment under pressure. And now? Now, I said, we decide what remains when the pressure's gone. Silence stretched, not uncomfortable, just honest. Luca reached into his jacket and removed the ring. He placed it in my hand. Keep it, he said. Not as ownership. As history. I closed my fingers around it. I won't disappear, I said. But I won't be central either. He smiled faintly. You never were. You were catalytic. That night, I walked alone through the city. No guards. No shadows. Just movement. Life. I passed the intersection where everything had begun, the red light, the crash, the moment fear had taken the wheel. Traffic flowed smoothly now. I stood there for a long moment. Then I crossed the street. Because the truth was simple. I hadn't married into power. I hadn't survived a monster. I hadn't been saved. I had learned how systems break. And how they rebuild around people who refuse to run. Somewhere behind me, a world recalibrated again. Without asking. Without chasing. And without me needing to look back.